Good evening, everyone. My name is Nao Mazer, and I'm a member of the World Affairs Series Planning Committee. It is my honor to introduce our guest tonight. Frances Moore Lappé is the author of 17 books, including Diet for a Small Planet, which sold 3 million copies, and her new book, Ego Mind, Changing the Way We Think to Create the World We Want, which will be available by the door. She is the co-founder of 3 organizations, including Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and, more recently, the Small Planet Institute, a collaborative network for research and popular education seeking to bring democracy to life. Frances and her daughter have co-founded the Small Planet Fund, which channels resources to democratic social movements worldwide. And now I would like to welcome Ms. Frances Moore Lappé.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I am delighted to be here. I was just informed that I was here for the first time 31 years ago. Wow. So, and I kind of remember it. You know why? Because it was the first time in my life that I appeared and got up on the stage and realized I'd left my speech on the plane. And I got through it. So I do remember it. I'm delighted that you're here. I want to tell you, and thank you so much for the World Affairs Series gang, who I've had the delight of meeting and having dinner with. And I want to just tell you about this photo before I start. This was taken by my daughter, Anna, who I work with, as you know. And she is the author of Diet for a Hot Planet. If you haven't read that, it's a great book, amongst others she's done. And she took this shot. And I just wanted to show you the context, or tell you the context. We were in the foothills of the Himalayas, and we'd just been visiting villages that were restoring traditional Indian farming practices and rejecting pesticides and chemical use. And so we had just left a village in which there was a hut, a big, a Hindu, with Hindu lettering all across the walls. And we asked our interpreter, Negi, what is all that writing on that one home? And he said, oh, it just says Monsanto out of here, no GMOs. And and then I, what? And he was just very, matter of fact about it. And that just sort of happens. And we, this is a place where you wouldn't think that people would feel that threatened by corporate intrusion, but there they were. So that was the slogan, the motto then of our organization, is what you're now reading, that we absorbed on that journey that we wrote about in the book Hope's Edge. So I'm going to tell you tonight about my journey in the sense that it's a big sweep picture that I'm going to be painting tonight, a journey that began for me 40 years ago, in one sense, because this is the fall, 40 years after I wrote, or after Diet for a Small Planet was published. And so I want to take you back to the late 60s, and to start this journey, I was this very intense young woman trying to figure out where to go with my life, and I thought, food, hunger. I mean, that seems pretty basic. If I could just understand why people were hungry in the world, that maybe that would give me direction and untangle some of the mysteries of economics and politics. And at that time, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, had just exploded, and we were being told, as we are today, that we'd reached the Earth's limits to feed us, and that famine was inevitable, right around the corner. So I thought, if I just go to the Ag Library, and I was then at UC Berkeley, if I just go to the Ag Library and spend enough time, I can figure out, is it true that we've really run out of food? And so there I was with my dad's slide rule, kind of putting 2 and 2 together. And very soon in that process, in a few months, I said to myself, wait a minute. All the experts and newspaper headlines are telling us we'd run out of food. Oh, I forgot to show you this. Let me try this. Up? No, down. No? This is your clicker. Can you? It's not used to this. Up at the top. Okay. So that was it. That's who I was, asking the big questions. Don't I look so serious? Okay. So it was why hunger. And then it soon became, why hunger in a world of plenty? That was even more mysterious. But then, over the decades, somewhere maybe 15 years ago or so, I came upon the biggest question of all. It's this. Why are we together creating a world that none of us as individuals would ever choose? That became the propulsion force of my life, in a sense. Why? How can I make sense of this? Because nobody gets up in the morning and says, yeah, today I'm going to make sure another child dies of hunger. Or, yes, I want to make sure, what did I just learn today? 5.2 tons of topsoil lost per acre in Iowa each year. Nobody gets up and says, that's a great idea. Global heating, nobody sets out consciously to say, yes, to disrupt our climate is a wonderful thing. What can I do today for that? So that became my question. And I've struggled with that question. And finally, through many great teachers, I've asked, okay, what could be so powerful to keep us from creating the world that virtually all of us want? And I realized there's only one thing that powerful. And I got a clue by asking, what are the unique aspects of human consciousness? And one of them is, that's very dramatic, is that human beings see the world through a mental map. That's what Anna and I call it, at least. I've heard it called thought forms, and Erich Fromm, one of my great mentors, called it a frame of orientation. But it's the idea that we all see the world not as it is, but as we are, in a sense, through a filter that we absorb, each of us, in our own cultures. Now, just to give you a really homey sense of how this works, I want to take you back to last Thanksgiving. When I got up in the morning, I knew 33 people were coming for Thanksgiving meal, and I wanted to make my favorite root vegetable dish. And I knew where my Dutch oven was, so I went for it. It's in that lower cupboard, but it wasn't there. So I went in the upper cupboard. It wasn't there. I went to the basement. It's not there. I got so frustrated, and I finally gave up and did something else. Only about an hour later, I turned around, and there it was, except I had put a plant in it. So, see, it's red. It's really obvious. And I didn't see it because I knew that I was looking for a kitchen object, not a planter. This is the power of frame. We really, literally do not see what we don't expect to see, and I wasn't expecting a planter, so I couldn't see my red Dutch oven. So this is a great challenge for our species. Now here's what the thesis of my life here is now, that you and I are alive in this extraordinary moment when the dominant mental map, the frame through which we're seeing, is fundamentally life-destroying. It is not just mal-aligned, as I say in EcoMind, but it is perversely aligned with nature and with what we now know about human nature. So that's really a problem. And I want to explain what I mean by that, and that's the journey I'm going to take us on, because there's a lot of good news here too, because we are in the midst of a significant shift in this fundamental way of seeing. So that's the journey I want to take us on. Okay. And, oh, by the way, there will be a, trying to figure out where to put this. Okay. There will be a clipboard moving around, if you would be so kind as to consider. My daughter and I do a quarterly e-letter. We don't bombard people, but we like to share with people who we feel common interests with. If you want to know what we're up to, what we're excited about, you could sign that. And then we also would get a notice if one of us is going to be back in the area. So that's going around now. And if we run out of space, just write it on the back of the page. Okay, so here is my thesis, is that we absorb a worldview, this mental map, in which we assume that reality is all made up of separate entities operating on their own, and that it is largely a world of stasis, things are fixed, and that it is a world of scarcity. It is a world of lack. So this is my attempt to capture what I am seeing that we are absorbing daily. We absorb it through the media. We absorb it through all sorts of political messages. It is the idea that there is not enough of anything. There is not enough goods and not enough goodness. And what I mean by that is that even many of my wonderful environmental heroes, plus others, reinforce this idea that say there's not enough there's not enough energy, for example. We hear the phrases like, we've hit the limits of a finite planet. Yikes. Or now with climate change, that food shortages are inevitable, we hear, and that, this recently with the 7 billion population, that clearly we've hit the limit. So this theme of whether it's energy or whether it's food, or I like to say in Boston, it's parking places, it's just not enough. It's just scarce. So we start then with the premise of scarcity. And it's not, of course, just energy or food. It is also scarcity of goodness. In human nature, we pick up the idea in our culture that if we just sort of peel away the fluff and get down to what we can count on in human beings, it's that we are self-centered, we're materialistic, and we're competitive. Now, from that point, and this is the spiral, from that point, then how can we possibly believe that we can come together in common problem solving and really figure things out together, which is what? Which is democracy. What it's about is listening to one another, compromising, creating solutions together. That's democracy, but how can we believe it? We can't. So, if we can't, then of course we can't trust government. Trust in government, I just learned recently, has fallen over the last several decades from 80% to 20%. And I just saw an interesting survey of an American trust, who you trust and who you don't trust. And we actually trust grocers trying to sell us things more than we now trust the FDA trying to protect us. It's really interesting. The distrust of government has become so deep. So if we distrust ourselves to come together, in other words, distrust the possibility of a democratic government, then what choice do we have? Well, not much, except to turn over as much as we possibly can to something that works on its own, something that works without us. And Ronald Reagan called it the magic of the market. Yes. Now, it's not any kind of market, though, and here's the catch, that what we've hit upon is kind of this peculiar idea that a market can work on its own without us by one rule, and that it's highest return to existing wealth. Well, then what happens is that wealth accrues to wealth accrues to wealth until you probably saw those numbers in the paper last week, that the top 1% of the country has doubled its share of, I believe that was an income measure, but Citigroup told us in 2005, Citigroup, not me, Citigroup said that we are now a plutonomy because the top 1% of us control more wealth than the bottom 90%. So that's not because there's some bad guys trying to take advantage of things. Largely, it is the logic, I believe, of this worldview. And then what happens is that concentrated wealth then begins to infuse and bend our political process because we have not believed enough in democracy to keep money out. And so then the consequences are extreme. They are extreme. As we see now, I was just thinking of, just the first point here, when we get up here to this point, concentrated wealth bends government to its interest. Consider that there are now 24 lobbyists in Washington for every person that you and I have elected to represent us there. So what happens? Well, we could talk all night about what happens. I just picked out a couple of examples of what feels so alarming just on this particular day, but to think that because of the agrochemical industry and other industries who do their work with those lobbyists and political contributions, we now know that there are serious pesticides, herbicides that are known to be very hazardous to our health that have been banned in Europe that are still allowed here. That's just one example, banned for a number of years in Europe, still allowed here. I was also looking today at Professor Bruce Babcock. Is he here by any chance? Don't see anybody recognize him. But just Okay, I was just reading his paper. It's just such a perfect example. I think it was just released today, and somebody handed it to me in Des Moines. It's such a perfect example. I think you can get a lot just from its conclusion, from the title. It's called The Revenue Insurance Boondoggle. This is talking about farm insurance system. Taxpayer-paid windfall for industry. And he points out about, in this paper, about how something that could be helping farmers is actually helping industry in a major way. And particularly, he goes into detail about the insurance industry itself, how it benefits from this. And he points out that one could have an insurance system, subsidy system that actually benefited farmers that could be $80 billion less than the current program. But it's not going to happen likely because the Farm Bill is now being worked out in such a secretive way. But 80 billion over 10 years, that is. But this is just a hint of the kinds of consequences. Another consequence of this movement to what I call privately held government, which should be an oxymoron, but is what has happened then in the financial industry that directly affects food and food prices. When you think about the financial industry moving from 20 or less than 20% of corporate profits to 40% of corporate profits, and gaining that power and to influence legislation, removing the standards that kept it more transparent and fair. And so that starting in the 1990s, but taking off much more recently, is our commodity indices. Commodity index funds, they're called, that have just ballooned. And these are futures contracts that are speculative. And so what happened is from, I think, 0.8 trillion to, they skyrocketed to almost 13 billion in value. And so this is just a consequence, I'm saying, of the relaxation of standards that allowed then those who have the wealth to work it for their interests, so that many people are now saying that this takeoff of commodity index funds is one significant reason we have such volatility now in food prices that is directly related to the increasing hunger in the world. Just over the last year, from September 10 to September 11, the price of rice, for example, leapt 26%, corn over 40%. So this is something of the consequences that are affecting everyday people capacity to eat. I also think about the inequalities increasing in the world, throughout the world, because of this mechanism of increasing concentration of wealth that I'm describing here, so that the phenomenon of land grabs, I'm sure many of you have heard this term now, that over the last decade, concern about both speculators looking for a good investment to make sure that they can get the highest return on their wealth, as well as certain governments buying up land in the global south, because land titles there are so informal that it's very easy to take this land. And one of the most striking examples at this moment is right here in Iowa, the company Agrosol Energy, that is, it looks like a deal may go through that would be over 800,000 acres of land in Tanzania, displacing 162,000 people who have been there for decades on this land and can't protect their rights to it. I'm just pulling these examples out to suggest the kinds of things that happen, from our own Farm Bill to commodity index funds to land grabs in Africa. These are all, I see, as some of the patterns that result from these extreme inequities of power that then infect public decision making. So then what happens? So where do we end up? We end up actually creating the experience of scarcity no matter how much we produce. Because compared to when I wrote Diet for a Small Planet, I was writing in the late 60s, there are like 20 to 30% more food produced per person than then. And yet we have historic hunger. Now almost 1 billion people going hungry. So what happens is then we actually generate the experience of scarcity for people, and we see what appears to be such greed and self-servingness, and so then what happens? We say, oh, all of our assumptions were founded. They're all confirmed. See, we really are just these selfish little shoppers. There really isn't enough. Reality is really all about scarcity. And then what happens? The fear, the blame, and the depression. Depression is now a global pandemic. There are now 50% more suicides in the world than homicides. So this cycle then intensifies because it keeps feeling like it is constantly being confirmed. So that's where I begin to define, like, how do I make sense of things? How do I make sense of things so that I can orient what I am doing with my life? And let me explain something else about what I'm doing tonight in another simple metaphor. I'm saying that the real problem on the earth today is not global heating or the food crisis. It is our feeling of powerlessness to manifest solutions to these problems, because I think there's plenty of evidence that solutions are known. And we can't move toward solutions unless we have some working hypothesis of how we got here. So the humble metaphor that my daughter and I use is this. It's okay to be a drop in the bucket. In fact, people say, oh, I'm a drop in the bucket, and just disparage their efforts. Actually, being the drop in the bucket is magnificent if we can see the bucket, right? So what I'm trying to do tonight is to draw a bucket in the sense of what is a context through which we can see how our positive effort, how hope and action can actually contribute to solutions. That's what I'm working for tonight with you. And so I want to step from this negative cycle into something else that gets me going every single day. The great privilege of my life, and certainly that journey that I took with that first image you saw that my daughter took in the Himalayas, that journey allowed me to see that something radically different from the scarcity mind that leads to powerlessness, something radically different is emerging. And it is based on a very different way of seeing life. It is based on not the idea of separateness and stasis, but very much rooted in the sciences, particularly the ecological sciences and breakthroughs in human understanding of human nature. It is a worldview that understands that life is really about these simple terms. It is as Philly. Yes, sorry.
They can't hear in the back.
Oh, no.
The mic is moving around, and so if you could adjust it so they could hear in the back.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I usually ask people to please holler at me. I'm very sorry. Is that better? Louder? Louder? There are seats up here as well. But please, I'm so sorry that you could not hear me. And please, wave wildly. It's so disappointing to learn later that you couldn't hear me. So, but there are seats up here, but mainly wave wildly if I start to fade away. Okay. Did you kind of get enough of it, though? I hope. Please, yes. Okay. So, one of my teachers is Dennis Noble, who's a physiologist at Oxford, and he says quite simply, and this is sort of the essence of these three words, he says that in biological systems, there are no privileged components telling the rest what to do. Rather, there is a form of democracy in which all of the elements are interacting to give shape to life, moment to moment. And so this is the picture that emerges now from all of it, whether we're talking physics or biology, ecology, this idea that we are the opposite of separate. We are so connected, and I'll talk later about how deeply that goes to a neurological level. But we are so connected then that, as my buddy in Germany, Hans-Peter Dürer, the physicist, says, Frankie, in biological systems, or all of our systems, there are no parts. There are only participants. So this is a much different way of seeing life, which makes possible a very different understanding of where we begin and where we can go. So I call it an eco-mind, to contrast it to a scarcity mind. And it's really all about possibility, because that is the nature. If you start with connection and change and co-creation, then possibility emerges. And so with an eco-mind, we can suggest, I'm going to go into this in a moment, that as we align with what we now know of nature, including human nature, there is more than enough for all of us. And that we recognize that human beings have these deep capacities I'm going to return to in a moment, but there's a great deal of evidence now, really a revolution in understanding human nature, our need for fairness and our enjoyment of cooperation and our also need for power, for efficacy, which means that, yes, we are capable of deliberative problem solving. We are capable of doing democracy, so to speak. That leads to a belief in ourselves that we have it in us to remove the power of concentrated wealth from our political system. And believing that, we can be freed from the fear from the grip of private wealth and have a government that answers to us. And from there, democratic rules are in place that are transparent and keep power dispersed, and markets, instead of being monopolized, remain open, competitive, and life-serving, creating the possibility for what I call a living democracy, aligning both social rules and our interactions with the earth with what we now know of the laws of nature. And so then fear recedes, trust grows, and we have a virtuous cycle possible. And so what I'm saying is not that this sounds like some pipe dream that Francis Moore Lappé has. I'm saying that this different way of seeing is actually emerging in places all over the world. But because we are looking through that scarcity mind frame, it's very hard for us to see it. And it certainly is not brought to us regularly by the media. But I'm saying its implications are life, earth-shaking, almost very literally. That we shift away from simply focusing on quantities of things, how many calories are we producing versus how many people on Earth. When there's such a mismatch already, we start to rather look in relationships of power meaning just our capacity to act. And so you might call the eco-mind the relational mind instead of just the quantitative mind, and its consequences are profound. For one thing, I want to focus on what happens with the eco-mind in relation to agriculture, because with the global climate crisis, most frequently, the challenge is framed as what? It's framed as how do we, as quickly as possible, reduce carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases. It's a question of this quantitative reduction. But of course, we really know that the challenge is how do we balance the carbon cycle? How do we balance the carbon cycle? So if we look in this flow rather than quantitative, then suddenly agriculture becomes extremely critical. And we recognize now that many people are saying that the degradation of soil actually has contributed as much as 25 to as much as 40% of the excess carbon in the atmosphere, which means then that we can understand why, if you add everything from nitrogen fertilizer to the refrigerator in our supermarkets, that some say that our food system actually contributes from 44%, I've seen estimates to as much as 57% of greenhouse gas emissions. But it also then tells us, we're thinking about the cycling of carbon, that as we begin to align our agriculture production with what we know of ecological sciences to restore the fertility, to restore the carbon holding capacity, we know that that this is a huge, huge part of the solution. That it's estimated that, in fact, there was an overview study I just looked at that estimated, based on compiling a number of studies, that if we began to relocalize our food production, if we reintegrated agriculture and livestock production, farming and livestock, and we developed agroecological practices and agroforestry, that over the next just a couple of decades, I mean, to the maximum, I mean, this is a projection of possibility, that we could actually reduce cut greenhouse gas emissions in half in just a few decades. So the potential there, as we begin to think like in a cycle and reprioritize our relationship with the earth, then suddenly our heroes, the people who we can turn to really look to for answers, are actually among the poorest people on the earth, because 70% of our food is still produced by small farmers, many of whom would be eager to learn agroecological approaches, which are now shown to produce higher yields, and even among in very poor soils. And so this is something that makes a very dramatic shift in perception. So I just want to give you a couple of examples to explain what I mean by this, to capture it in real people doing real things. So what we begin to see is something that I just happened upon to learn about. For example, the extent to which agroforestry is improving the lives of people in one of the poorest countries in the world, the country of Niger, which 2 years ago was the lowest on the Human Development Index for the entire world. And yet, over the last 20 years, poor farmers in Niger have begun to realize that if they nurture the trees in their fields in a form of agroforestry, and nurture trees that actually help to fertilize the soil in it, and also help to keep the soil from blowing away, because part of that country is very much turning into a desert. So to keep the soil there, and to produce fodder and fruit and fuel from the foliage and the branches. So over less than 20 years, small farmers in Niger have regreened, and I'll show you this photograph, have regreened 12.5 million acres. 12.5 million acres, 200 million trees they have nurtured, and the last estimate is that this has created food security for 2.5 million people who were experiencing severe food insecurity. And I saw this conversation, I read a conversation with a village chief. He said, "We stopped the desert and everything changed." The young men wanted to return to the village. People were just seeing a sense of possibility they did not have before. And so that is one example. And I asked my informant, a Dutch sustainability researcher who's visited many times, I said, "Chris Riesch, why didn't I know about this?" And you know what he said? He said, "Frankie, nobody thought to look because we didn't think it was possible. Nobody was looking at regional change of this scale. And only a few years ago did this start to become known and followed so that it could be shared and replicated elsewhere." So I thought that was so interesting. Again, back to our mental maps. We don't see what we don't expect to see. I just want to give you another example of what I'm talking about, a very dramatic one in India. The pesticide capital of the world, it's often been called, is Andhra Pradesh, a state in India that has a lot of dryland agriculture, a lot of poor farmers who were trying desperately by using the new commercial seeds, trying genetically modified cotton, trying anything to survive. And gradually they realized that their health was decreasing because they were just dependent on the subsidized white rice. They weren't eating diversified crops. Their GMO cotton was failing. Many were dying from suicide. Many were poisoned by pesticides. And so they started another journey. And over now, really a 10-year period, now 3,000 villages are engaged in a process they call the non-pesticide movement. It's a women's-led movement. It's also called Community Sustainable Agriculture Movement. And the beauty of this, it's a village-by-village effort where the farmers themselves pledge to one another not to use chemicals. And it's all very transparent, but they try to keep each other accountable. And there are even, big posters in the villages showing what the average income is from those who are going the way non-pesticide direction versus those who are still using pesticides, so everybody can see what's happening. Because as it had been in Andhra Pradesh, that on average farmers spent a half of all of their income just on seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers. So this was a huge burden that was lifted as they began to move in this direction. And so now the state government has gotten behind this, and 3,000 villages are involved. And they're involved with seed sharing and seed saving, with celebration every year where they go village to village to village with festivals where people share what they're learning about seeds and which ones work best and how to save them and share them more. So these are just two examples of what I'm talking about here. And it is that shift then really to the sense of possibility, moving away from the, there's not enough and I'm afraid and I'm just going to grasp for that, and trusting back to the beginning there, trusting that by collaborating with one another, they could find the answers by understanding more about the ecology of their area and actually working with that, developing their own what I call pesticide potions, these ingredients. That was a sort of little cottage industry now that is built up, because instead of their money going off to the pesticide supplier in some other country, they're actually creating, learning more about their own ecology, about how to use, whether it's neem, whether it's chilies, whether it's urine of some of the animals, how can we use what we have, and seeing this incredible burst of health. They said the food tastes a lot better too. So this is a sense of, by just these two examples, of what I mean that can happen when we start from this different premise of possibility that then begins this spiral of empowerment. But I want to move from these examples to, I forgot, there's one more point here, that just another little example that I happen to run into about how this eco-mind then can shed the idea of waste. You think today of our food system, how typically in the world we're wasting a third of our food. What if we began to see that there need be no waste from an eco-mind? So I had the fortune of being in a poor barrio in a beautiful city in Colombia a few years ago, Manizales, and I met women there who were taking this that you might wonder, what is that? It looks like dirt, but actually that is coffee waste. Coffee waste, you can imagine how much they have of that in Colombia. And they discovered in this inner city barrio, they discovered that they could use it as substrate for mushrooms. And soon, these women who were unemployed and so desperately eager to have an income to feed their families were able to create then this very high-grade mushroom and begin to sell it and to share recipes and to create this culture. And in fact, somebody's estimated if on every coffee farm in the world this kind of cycle were brought to life, that would be 50 million new great jobs right there. And then what waste was generated here was fed to livestock. So that is another way of seeing the possibility, just one of which there are so many millions of examples in the world today. So I want to now apply this same lens to human society and to human nature for a minute, and I explain what I mean here. Is that that if we begin to think that use the same eco lens and looking at human relationships, remember the scarcity mind starts with the assumption of lack of human goodness. So we're just these basically selfish little shoppers. So what does the eco mind tell us? One, it recognizes that in fact, as I said, there is this revolution underway in understanding human nature. It is a revolution that it's a result of new anthropology, archaeology, as well as in neuroscience. We are realizing that actually, because we evolved in tightly knit tribes, that I like to say we're soft-wired, not hardwired, but soft-wired to experience empathy. For example, how many of you have heard of mirror neurons? Okay, it's really interesting. In the 1990s in Italy, they discovered that there are neurons in our brains, so that when I'm doing this, actually, there are neurons in your brain firing as if you were doing this. So our empathy is just who we are, that we cannot not walk in someone else's shoes in that sense. Cooperation. When they look at our brains when we're either cooperating or competing, they find that when we're cooperating, that it's like eating chocolate. It's so pleasant that our pleasure centers are so stimulated. So that these capacities, if we look at what science is now telling us, we see that we have this possibility that is the very basis of a democratic society. Yes, the capacity to actually cooperate over time toward a common good. So it's there. Now, I get to this list and then I say, okay, but, if we're so great, then how did we get into this mess? And that is a good question. And this is where the eco-mind helps out. Because yes, we have these capacities that we can count on, but we also know that under certain circumstances, that we, not a few bad guys, now it's all greed, Wall Street greed, as if there were a class of greedy people. I don't buy that. I think that history shows us, lab experiments in which we've been the guinea pigs, show us that under the wrong conditions, most of us, not a few of us, most of us will behave with ultimate cruelty. I think back to 1971 at Stanford, when I was writing Diet for a Small Planet at Berkeley. Some of you are smiling, you know where I'm going with this. When I was writing Diet for a Small Planet at Berkeley, Philip Zimbardo was at Stanford carrying out the prison experiment, which he put normal young people, they tested normal on all the psychological tests, into a mock prison setting. Some were guards, some were prisoners, supposed to last for 2 weeks, and they had to stop the experiment because the guards were so brutalizing the prisoners that later Dr. Zimbardo said it looked like Abu Ghraib. And then, of course, we have to recognize the Holocaust was not the result of a madman and a few sadistic guards. Ordinary people. Read the book Ordinary Men about Battalion 101, sent out from Hamburg, Germany, to shoot point blank in their villages Jews. At first, 90% would not go along. By the end, 90% did go along and murdered point blank 38,000 Jews. The pressure, that group pressure. So I'm saying that an eco-mind then gets us thinking like this. Okay, we are like an organism, like any organism in the ecosystem. We know what our house plant, what our corn, we know what our plants need to thrive. Let's look at human beings. What are the conditions that bring out the best in us, and what conditions bring out the worst in us once we acknowledge that most of us have the capacity for brutality? And so I will hazard tonight and you can push back in the Q&A, I'm going to say that I think I have a hunch about what are the conditions that have shown to bring out the worst in us. They are concentrated power, as we now see. In the examples, those sort of random examples I was pulling out in the beginning. Concentrated power, we don't do well. When I think of lack of transparency, I think of what's happening with the Farm Bill right now. But I also think of what happened on Wall Street just a few years ago when all those toxic derivatives were being invented and people were selling what they now call liar's loans. Do you know that one of the slogans among the Wall Street people creating that was IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone, meaning that I'll be out of here because it's so secretive. It was so non-transparent. So it doesn't do us well. And cultures of blame is the third condition. When it's Obama, no, it's the Tea Party, and vice versa. A culture of blame where we think, we are okay, it's the other guy who's the problem. So I think these conditions, the final one being a culture that I think is created largely by the top two, but however we want to sort it out, I'm pretty convinced that they bring out some pretty ugly things in us. So at least this gives me guidance on what to do. Because if that's true, then we know that the opposite brings out the best in us. And so we can start imagining, what would it mean if we sort of did a checklist of our lives, of how we're living? Are we helping to create these conditions of continuing dispersion of power, of transparency, of mutual accountability instead of the blame game? That gives us some sense of direction. And so I would like to talk then a minute about what that begins to look like. Because you know the old saw, seeing is believing, but we are not made that way, we human beings. We have to believe in the possibility of this first. And so I've reversed that in my mind. We have to believe in something as possible before we start to see it. So it's tricky though, right? It's very tricky. How do we do this? So I'm going to ask you to, at least for a while tonight, suspend disbelief in the possibility of what I'm beginning to describe here. I'm suggesting that there is a way of seeing, that connects us with one another, connects us with the earth, to our own bodies. And one of the reasons that I'm so tickled that as a young woman that my intuition was that food had special power, and then now 40 years later, there's actually a food movement that I can say I'm part of. And it does have this very special power to begin to break through the scarcity mindset, because it is an actual contradiction, right? Because it's nothing like relating to the earth through food begins us to see the possibilities for our own power. And so I am suggesting that this power of food is emerging in all sorts of ways that begins to allow us to believe in the possibility of what I'm calling living democracy, this ongoing dispersion of power that I'm going to describe. So what gets me so excited these days is that in particular, not just in the food movement, but particularly in the food movement, how this dispersion of power, the transparency, and the mutual accountability is showing up. I think, as I said earlier, reminding us that 70% of the world's food is still produced by small farmers who have been, for most of the 40-year journey, they have been invisible and voiceless. And now, starting in the 90s and growing, there is an international organization called Via Campesina. I know many of you know of it, representing 150 organizations, 200 million peasants, 200 million around the world, small farmers around the world, and that it's organized so that in a democratic, transparent way, so that there's a rotating leadership and there's a man and a woman who share leadership. It's gained in stature to the point that it has now been invited to be a member of to sit, I should say, as part of the World Food Committee, beginning to think about how do we deal with the world food crisis that has worsened because of the concentration of power. So that is just one example. I see it in the Iowa Food Democracy Now! People. Anybody here from Food Democracy Now!? But that is an organization that is alerting me and keeping me posted right now on what is happening with the debate on the food bill, just as one example, and alerting us to actions that we can take. I think about the Oakland Institute that I'm so proud to say is helping to alert us to the problem of land grabs and how we can go to the Oakland Institute website and weigh in ourselves on this Tanzanian deal, for example. It is a very powerful tool. I think of this emergent power of the food movement breaking through the myth of scarcity. I see it in the Real Food Challenge, which is a youth-originated movement that started just a few years ago. Young people came together and said, what if we started a campus movement that got people on their campuses to get their administrations to make a commitment to 20% of the food served on that campus to be what they call real food by the year 2020. Is there a real food chapter here? I think that there is. I think I was just told that yesterday. But there are now, they started out, they thought the first year they'd get 100 campuses. Now they have over 300 campuses. I was just at UMass Amherst, and they're going to go way ahead of that 2020 goal of 20% of the food being real in terms of organic, local food by 2020. So I see this movement emerging is, again, the dispersion of power through the farmers markets movement. Remember back when I started out that there weren't even enough farmers markets for USDA to count them, and there were ordinances that prevented them in many states. And I just realized that last year there were 17%, in 1 year, a 17% increase in farmers markets. And I understand that Iowa is second per capita in the country in terms of farmers markets. It's an example of the kind of transparency and mutual accountability, because we as eaters are stepping up and supporting our local farmers, as well as, of course, the community-supported agriculture movement embodies these elements that I'm suggesting are the positive that bring out the best in us. Because we as eaters then help shoulder the cost up front of the farmers beginning the planting season. And of course, the cultural impacts of these innovations are not to be minimized. I was so struck in our CSA experience that the impact was kind of amusing, but also I think significant, is that in our extended family, there's a grandson who had gone with us all summer to the CSA. By the time Halloween came around, he wanted to be a farmer for Halloween. And the only farmer he'd ever met was a woman, which I thought was even more cool. So there is much afoot that begins then to suggest a new way of thinking about our relationship to each other in the economics of food. And it has to do with also the governance of thinking of democracy as a living practice. So I just put a taste of what I was getting at here. This is a picture of farmers in Mali who are participating in a citizens' jury process. Citizens' jury is a technique of bringing diverse people together, randomly selected from all sides of an issue, bringing them together over some period of days where they are exposed to the same information, have a chance to debate it. And in Mali, it was a debate about what direction should our agriculture take in this country. And over this time together, the academics and the researchers in agriculture, the small, the large farmers, and others gathered together, and the path they chose together was one they decided they did not want to import genetically modified organisms. And maybe the most dramatic outcome of this discussion was that farmers said, bring us in to your agricultural research. Let us farmers have a voice in the direction of the research for agriculture in Mali. I also think about, when I think about this shift in governance, of participatory governance, I think of food policy councils. I understand here in Iowa, there is a newly reconstituted food policy council that now, and I love it, you all put the term systems in it, but food systems policy council that is, again, diverse stakeholders coming together, embodying the kind of democracy that the scarcity mind tells us we're not capable of, where people are deliberating together to come up with common solutions. There are now 100 of these in the United States. I was just in Hawaii, where, believe it or not, the governor of Hawaii was elected on the platform of food self-sufficiency and food sustainability for Hawaii, which is now 85% dependent on imports, which is, I understand, the same for the state of Iowa. And there is a food policy council working with the governor. He won with a landslide, and that was one of his key platforms. And also, I just wanted to mention here, because it is so dramatic, the possibility of this participatory governance in things that relate to the earth, is in India. I was so struck by recent research that there are now 10 million households involved in India in community-based forest protection. It's called forest management groups. The government has devolved responsibility to these democratically organized groups in villages involving 100,000 groups, 10 million households, as I said, to protect the forest. And the research says that as long as there are 3 women in leadership at least, then it really is working well. And I love that. And that is one reason then that India is one of the few countries in the world in which forest cover is increasing and the health of the forest is improving. So these are just, again, a taste of possibility as we shift to this relational worldview where we begin to trust that we can come together in common decision making and learn how to relate to the earth in a way that is satisfying. And what does it mean, though, when we take this to a national level? And what I know that the ex-president of Brazil, Lula, just won a food prize, World Food Prize here. And so I want to just use this as an example of what can happen at a national level when we start to think relationally instead of just in quantities and numbers of people versus numbers of bushels, so to speak. And what happened in this country, Brazil, which is a very capitalist country, very market-driven country with a lot of inequality, but in 2003, Lula was elected president, and they began a zero hunger campaign that has reduced infant mortality, reduced infant death, which is a very strong measure of hunger in a country, by 1/3 already. Now, how can this happen, right? Because in many ways, if you visit some of the big cities in Brazil, it feels like you could be in this country. How could this happen when our poverty is increasing and hunger is increasing? The opposite here. Well, just over 20 years ago, citizens of Brazil gathered together and believed in themselves enough to create a party, a workers' party, that then put in place governors, mayors, etc., and gradually build up enough strength that they could elect a party, the Workers' Party president, the laborer President Lula, who then declared the goal of zero hunger. That says Fome Zero, zero hunger. And Anna and I happened to have the privilege of visiting the city before Lula was elected. We visited the city that then became the model for his zero hunger campaign. So we got a sense of how this happened. And in this city, the mayor ran on food as a human right as his platform. He was elected, and instead of just lengthening the soup lines or making bigger handouts, what he did was bring all segments of the society together and created numerous programs that could happen in any city, like, for example, using small plots of city-owned land and making it available to organic farmers who would come in from the countryside. It was called Direct from the Countryside. And they could then use that land in some of the poor areas if they kept the price of their wonderful produce within the reach of the poorest people. They developed that program and many other programs that over 10 years cut infant death by 60%. And I calculated how much it cost, and it cost 2 pennies per resident, 1 cent, 1 cent per resident per day. Is that what it amounted to? And so I'm suggesting by using this example and showing you here in this picture my daughter took of some of the beneficiaries in Brazil, these little kids. And this then brings me to the final part of my talk, because how come they look so healthy? How come poverty has gone down over, I believe it was just a 7-year period, by 25% at least, and I've seen estimates as much as 40%. How come? It's because their parents believed enough in themselves that they came forward and worked for a government that they could hold accountable and held it accountable for things that they believed in. What does that then tell us at the most personal level? And so I'm going to go from this big picture to the more personal level, because this is what I think is needed, right? I call it bold humility. And what I mean by that is that you now know, you've heard my talk, you know that I think we're good enough. You know that I think that, we have this great capacity for cooperation. I've shown you examples. We are hardwired for empathy, or soft-wired, I like to say, for empathy and for efficacy, all these things. But precisely because we evolved in such tightly knit tribes, we knew that separation from the pack was so scary because that was kind of sure death if we got kicked out of the tribe. And so here we are in the 21st century, when, as I kind of think of it, like the tribe is heading over the falls, but we've got to separate. But it still brings up fear, even though at this point, saying things that aren't the dominant mental map are scary, they are actually enhancing life. So the fear that comes up, we've got to learn to rethink it, because we may be otherwise the first species for whom the fear response is actually doing us in, if we just take it literally. If we think, to separate from the group, that's scary, I can't do that, wrong place, I've got to do something else. When what we need now is more and more of us able to walk with our fear of being different. And so that's what I'm talking about with the bold part. So we can rethink fear too, and recognize that in some ways, fear is just energy. It's just energy that we can use for what we want. And so I have a cheesy gimmick that I use. And so I used to think when I felt those fear emotions come up, my heart go chop, 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 like that. And I would think, oh, you wimp. But then, with this understanding, I began to think, I think I'll just call that inner applause. And it kind of works. It kind of works. So this is what I mean, but we also have to rethink power. We have to rethink fear, that it may be telling us we're doing exactly what we need to be doing. But what about power? Because in this society, we're told that power is ugly, it's control, it's manipulation. What is power? It's just our capacity to act, after all, to manifest the solutions that are all around us, after all. So we can rethink power as what we have because of this relational worldview. We have so much more than we thought we did. In other words, I mentioned the mirror neurons earlier. That I did, didn't I? Yeah, sorry. So what does that mean? It means that as people are watching you folks who are out there organizing this lecture series, any of you who are stepping out and doing things that are a little bit, taking leadership, people are watching you and say, there's something I like about that. Maybe I could do that. Everything that we are doing, there is somebody watching us. And they are then learning that possibility. So there's nobody on earth that has zero power in that sense. And so that is really one of the things that I'm talking about here. But there's another piece of this. And I have to go then to the idea that as we begin to think like an ecosystem, if you will, we can then begin to identify what are the roots. And sometimes it gets really scary if we start identifying the deepest roots. And so this is then to that point. That you've heard me many times tonight talk about the power of money in politics, and how do we gain belief that we can remove power of money from politics. And I would say, as we step up with the possibility of a true living democracy, we have to believe that this is possible. And a lot of Americans have just decided it's not possible. And so I say, tell that to Deb Simpson. Deb Simpson lives in Maine. She was a single mom, a waitress in the year 2000. But because they have clean elections in Maine, where you can run for office and it's called voluntary public financing, you can get enough money to run a credible race. She was able to run. She got $5 from 50 people because she was a waitress. Hey, that made it a little bit easier. She is a stellar legislator now, working on environmental issues, has been reelected 4 times. That system, that main system of voluntary public financing, we citizens can make that national. There are now 2 pieces of legislation, one in each house, that is, in the House, it has 75 co-sponsors. There's many other pieces to this idea about how we can make our political system transparent so that political contributions all have to be visible, known, that I can talk about. But this is key piece of it. And so that means a certain amount of boldness to believe that is possible. But I also want to suggest then, and the humility piece of it. I want to say about the bold part that this is the person in my life that has represented boldness to me. And so I want to introduce you to her if you do not know Wangari Maathai, because she is the person more than anyone else. She planted 7 trees on Earth Day in 1977 and continued to push for through the Greenbelt movement, which she founded. Even after beatings and jailings, she continued to step forth until more and more trees. I'm going to come to this in just a moment. But I want to leave Wangari's image here because she passed away on September 25th. And she leaves a legacy of this kind of boldness that I'm talking about tonight, like no other person I've ever met. And so I'd like to honor her by leaving this here for just a moment. But she's also taught me about this humility piece. And that is that what I mean by the bold humility, the humility piece, is that with an eco-mind where we know that we are all interconnected and change is the only constant, then we have to be ready for surprises. That is the humility part. And it's very empowering. When I returned from this trip that you saw, a piece of it, when that picture my daughter took, we returned from that journey, I looked at my daughter and I said, honey, do you realize everything we saw on this trip, whether it was those farmers in the foothills of the Himalaya or Wangari's tree planting effort, everything we saw, I would have given almost no chance of success when I was your age. And so what does that mean? That is really humbling. That is really humbling. Now I can't possibly say that something's impossible because I was so wrong. I was so wrong. And so what I try to do and what I recommend is that we each develop this checklist. This is the humility part that's so empowering. Develop a checklist for yourself. What are the things that most inspire you today that if somebody had told you about them 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you would have given them almost no chance of success? Certainly Brazil is on my short list. I would never have picked Brazil as a place that I would be tonight telling you an inspiring turn in that country. But there are just so many other examples. Certainly I would never have predicted that here I am in 2011, and just in the last decade, organic acreage throughout the world has tripled in one decade. Or a country like Austria could now be over 18% organic agriculture in a very short period of time. On the economic and agriculture front, I could flash back to Viroqua, Wisconsin in 1988, where I was sitting with a handful of farmers and who were dairy farmers and telling me they wanted to start a marketing co-op. And I said, oh, well, that's nice, And would I have ever believed that those little handful of fellows would create something that by 2011 would be a $500 million business? You know who I'm talking about? I'm talking about Organic Valley Cooperative. So I would never have imagined that to be possible. And I want to then mention Wangari again, because when she planted those 7 trees on Earth Day, she was mocked when she then went to the foresters and said, we want to start a village movement of tree planters. And the forester said, no, it takes foresters to plant trees. And she said, no, I think village women can do it. And after they dismissed her, she went through all this struggle. Now we see from 30 to, I've seen the estimate, 45 million trees in Kenya because of Wangari Maathai beginning those 7. Then, after she won the Nobel Peace Prize, she inspired in collaboration with the UN environmental program, they thought up this Plant for the Planet. How many of you have heard of Plant for the Planet? I had never heard of it until I went to a high school in Leipzig, Germany. It was totally random. But it is a global movement to plant trees. In 2007, they set the goal of 1 billion trees a year around the world. And I read about that, and you know what my response was? I'm a slow learner. You know what my response? Well, that's nice, but that's pretty ambitious. I hope they're not too disappointed. I went back just last year, and we are now over 11 billion trees, way beyond what they anticipated. And you know what country in the world is the best tree planters out there? Turns out to be Ethiopia, and in part because the Boy Scouts got so activated. So the point is that I am gradually learning about the possibility of bold humility from the point of view of eco-mind. And the implication of an eco-mind is profound, because if we really take it seriously, then we know that the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world. If we really are so connected, we really are modeling each other moment to moment, interconnected through these mirror neurons, if we know that we can walk with fear, we don't have to let it stop us, then the only choice we don't have is whether to change the world, because we are every day. It's how we do it. That is the choice. The other implication I realize I've summarized in this last word I would like to leave with you. It's very simple. That from an ecological worldview, it is not possible to know what's possible. And if we really believe that, I've started to call myself not a pessimist, not an optimist, but a possibilist. It's not possible to know what's possible. And that is the ultimate freedom. It's the freedom to really know that we can go for the world that we want. And I've so appreciated your attention tonight, and I'm so eager for your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.